This is Apollo 11. Hundreds of kilometers away from the Earth are three men in this rocket who are on their way to become the first to land on the lunar surface. NASA is confident and mostly everything is under control. But remember, nobody knows what the space can offer them. What are those obstacles which these men will face, and will they be successful in their missions? Join me on this marvelous adventure of the biggest achievement in the history of mankind. This is Man to the Moon. Episode 3. The Eagle has landed. The rocket completes its stages of separation and gets pulled out of the Earth's gravitational pull. We will get back to the Saturn V rocket, but first, let's talk about the plan of action. How is the spacecraft going to land on the moon? Earlier it was thought a single rocket will be sent to the moon, and that rocket itself will again take off from the moon and come back to Earth. They had also thought of taking an entire space station to the moon, which would act like a base for the astronauts. A third option was also there, but it was not very popular. The third option was that the three modules would be sent to the moon and only the lunar module would descend to the moon, while the command and service module would orbit the Earth. Despite the fact that this option was not very popular, some people believed that this idea was possible. One of them was John Hubble. The lunar orbit rendezvous was more complex than any other two options in terms of moving parts, but it could be worked out with smart techniques. In 1962, NASA actually accepts the option of the lunar orbit rendezvous and finally considered it to be the method to go to the moon. Coming back to Apollo 11, on July 28, 1969, after making 13 orbits of the moon, the lunar module, which was called the Eagle, was preparing to land, with Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin in it, and it was piloted by Michael Collins. The lunar module disengages itself from the command module, and the two men start heading towards the moon to make history, while the engineers in mission control at Houston have held their breaths. Neil Armstrong spotted the landing site and everything was going according to plan. But at 6,000 feet above the lunar surface, the screens of the Eagle's computer started flashing and the alarms went off. This was because of overloading.
They had found in simulations just a couple of days before that if they ran both systems that they had on board for landing, that it would overload the computer and they'd get a 1201 alarm.
Distracted by the alarms, Armstrong did not realize that the computer was taking them straight towards a rocky slope of a huge crater on the moon. The Eagle was on a trajectory to crash on the lunar surface. Tension arises in mission control, but something interesting happens inside the cockpit. Neil Armstrong, with his calmness, switches to manual mode and gives the mission all he has got. Yet again, his calm composure saves his life. The fuel systems were running out, and a site had to be found immediately with only 60 seconds left. they had only 3% fuel with them. Neil Armstrong finally safely lands in the Sea of Tranquility. It was Sunday 20th July 1969, 3:17 p.m. and 39 seconds when Neil Armstrong breaks silence and says these historical words.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Without Neil's calm presence of mind, in such great pressure, Apollo 11 would never be successful. Now a decision had to be made, that who would set his foot first on the lunar soil. Buzz Aldrin for a long time thought that he was the first one to set his foot on the moon, but NASA's decision behind the scenes was to let Neil be the first to step on the moon because he was closer to the door than anyone else and would easily exit first. After a few minutes, Neil Armstrong sets foot on the ladder, separating the moon from the lunar module. The entire world had stopped breathing. In black and white televisions, the image transmitted by the camera was very mediocre, but enough to unite the entire world. Armstrong lets himself drop to the ground and he pronounces those legendary words which immediately became history.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Armstrong claimed that these words were not previously memorized by him, but were actually improvised by him on the spot itself. After around 19 minutes, Buzz Aldrin finally exits the spacecraft.
Buzz steps out onto the porch on the lander to go down, and so he says to Neil, "I'm getting ready to close the door." And Neil says, "Okay, but don't lock it." If they'd locked themselves outside, then you'd have had a problem, you know.
Buzz and Neil start to photograph different parts of the moon. And sometime later, after studying the moon, it was time to place the American flag. This was a historic moment for the world. The flag stood still as a symbol of success for mankind.
When are you gonna come down? When are you going to land? I should have stayed on the phone. I should have listened to my own mind. You know you can't hold me forever. I didn't sign up with you. I'm not a present for your friends to open. This boy's too young to be singing.
Their lunar activities are interrupted by a telephone call from former American President Richard Nixon. The two men stood together looking into the camera and talked to the president.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a great honor and privilege for us to be here.
They only had 2 hours, therefore they quickly completed studying the moon and collected over 50 pounds of lunar rocks from the moon. After studying and collecting rocks, it was finally time to leave the moon. Before leaving, Buzz Aldrin took this iconic photo of his footstep. Many magazines around the world claimed that it was the first footstep of man to the moon, but that was actually incorrect. The actual first footstep was obliterated by the coming and going of astronauts. This photo was not the first footstep on moon, but in fact one of the last footsteps of them on the moon. The men get up the ladder and they say goodbye to the lunar surface. On the other hand, Michael Collins had been orbiting the moon for more than 24 hours and was now getting ready to welcome his crewmates. Michael Collins was the saddest part of this mission because he never got a chance to land on the moon, but yet his role was the most important in the entire mission. While he was waiting, another problem arises back on the moon. Buzz Aldrin accidentally breaks on the ignition switches of the propulsion system while re-entering the cabin. Now it was impossible to lift off. This was a very big issue. The turn of fate was so unfortunate that President Nixon had created an alternate speech just in case if the men don't return back to Earth. But fortunately, Nixon did not have to recite that speech because in the lunar module, Neil Armstrong came up with a genius idea. He saw a pen in the spacecraft and with that pen, he completed the circuit and now finally liftoff was possible. The engines are ignited and the men take off from the moon. Michael Collins on the other hand adjusts his trajectory in order to receive his crewmates. Collins receives his friend in the command service module and the men now come back towards the Earth's atmosphere. On 24th July 1969, after almost 200 hours after takeoff, the Apollo 11 capsule lands in the Pacific Ocean. The three men were immediately placed in quarantine as soon as they returned to make sure that they haven't caught any unwanted or harmful virus or bacteria from space. The three men instantaneously become heroes in the eyes of the people. They go on a world tour and the entire nation feels proud for the three men. America finally wins the space race. As everyone celebrates the success of Apollo 11, we must remember the sacrifices made by the crew of Apollo 1. A dream started in 1961 by President John F. Kennedy was finally fulfilled in 1969 by NASA and President Nixon. This single event united the world, and it was not an achievement of NASA or the USA, but an achievement for mankind. A giant leap for mankind. But the story does not end here. After Apollo 11, 6 more missions were conducted till Apollo 17. Why did the public suddenly lose interest in NASA space missions? Why was Apollo 13 the most dangerous mission in the history of mankind? Was Apollo 13 a success? And why, since the last 50 years, No country went back to the moon. Questions like these are still unanswered. But these questions will be answered in